Alan Mossman, and I'm based in the UK. I met Greg in 2002. Um, I learnt about Last Planner from observing its effects on projects in Heathrow Airport in the central area, and I wanted to know more. So I got in touch. Greg responded immediately, and I came across for a workshop that Greg was running in Las Vegas in the Gambling Institute. From where I came from, I ended up doing some of the teaching with Greg because I'd bought a simulation that I was trying to develop, and we experimented with it in the workshop with other people. So that was, that's part of the way Greg was. He was, really encouraging and enabling of people and ideas. It was brilliant. And then I later came across, and we went to visit some construction sites with Messer Construction in Cincinnati, and that's another example or an example of a privately owned company, and they're the people who really seem to invest time in moving in a lean direction, because it was that there were no quarterly reports to shareholders. They could focus their attention on their pensions, so they were taking a long-term view, and that's where a lot of the initial investment in lean construction has been, I think. Of a creek up in Idaho, south of Ketchum, watching him fish. Got a lovely photograph of him. He was fly fishing, in waders in the river. Lots of moths flying around. It's just lovely. He was just totally focused, having a whale of a time. It was really great. And he's talked quite a lot about fishing in Ireland, fishing at home. That was really part of his unwinding, I think. Sure. But one of the things that Dean said to me just before I walked in was, remember what Greg would have said to you. And I said, oh, what was that? He said, don't screw it up.
Cynthia Tao. I am an advocate, a student, a learner of lean construction since 1997. And I got to know Greg starting in 1999 when I worked with him on a case study for lean construction to learn about how to improve the way we organize work on projects. Greg, I definitely learned how powerful the use of simulations are because they can help affect people and help them change and start thinking about changing their mindset and understanding of how things work on projects to help them develop a good mood for learning. That's why we love simulations so much, and we talked a lot about it last week actually in Canada at the International Group for Lean Construction 30th annual conference. We continued on with the Greg Howell, simulations exchange because of him. And Greg also helped me appreciate, the spirit of exploring new ideas and challenges. And he modeled for us all, especially me, the value of helping others. And so I continue to do that because of his, modeling it. He was just a really good person who would always help as best he could anyone who asked. He owes a debt of gratitude to everyone, to their family, friends, and to Greg's family, friends, and colleagues for sharing so much of him with us, his time, his energy, his advice, and his inspiration. We all thank his family especially for that. I had helped LCI through the years as a student. I often attended the meetings at the Berkeley Marina, the LCI meetings. I was always a student helper. And later on, as I got more closer to graduation, I was still involved in helping as well. And after I was almost close to finishing my PhD, and I was interviewing with different universities, and I finally got accepted to be a professor at the University of Cincinnati. And so at around that time, there was a 2003 LCI meeting about contracting in Las Vegas. Greg and Glenn and I had dinner at a Chinese restaurant. And I remember this detail after the event because I'm Chinese American and it wasn't really a good thing to go to a Chinese restaurant. But I was like, fine, because Greg and Glenn insisted to me that it's actually good Chinese food. I'm like, okay, fine, I'll go. And during dinner, Greg and Glenn actually lamented to me that they felt that they needed to close LCI. And I was wondering why. Why would you close it? And they sort of said, well, they asked me, do you not notice, Cynthia? We're getting kind of old. And after a point, they were actually working with trying to form a partnership with multiple associations to try to see if they can find a way to help sustain LCI in this way. But none of those paths were working out. As also, they noted, to make matters worse, it seemed that no one was stepping up to help manage and run LCI. At that time, remember, I had been working as a student since 1997 to try to advance lean construction. And so in 2003, I was like, my goodness, I've just spent 6 years of my career devoted to the cause. I believe in the cause, and now you want to close the organization that advances this cause. I was like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. I'm about to, and actually, I wish I could help you, but I've just accepted to join the university, so I'm going to help the university. But I was like, well, but if I did help you guys, what would my title be? And Glenn said, how about the Grand Poobah? And I was like, but seriously, he said, we really need someone to step up and help run the Lean Construction Institute, to help it grow and sustain on improving project outcomes throughout the world. A few years later, starting in 2008, I did just that, actually. And I became LCI's first assistant executive director. And in that capacity, I helped Greg form sort of an organizational foundation for the Lean Construction Institute. I helped oversee the growth of around 4 to 5 LCI communities of practice. And it grew to at least 17 by the time I was done. And it was a challenge. It was a very challenging time at LCI because from 2008 to 2011, there are many, many people within the US and abroad that wanted to be affiliated with LCI, but they asked for LCI support in ways that would have put LCI at great financial risk. So Greg empowered me to learn to say no to many of them, and who requested LCI's help, and I uncomfortably did. Luckily, with a solid, actually a painful piece of advice that he gave to me, happened much later on in my career. After maybe it might have happened either while I was a professor or after I was a professor. But at one point he said to me, Cynthia, metrics don't convince. And I was stunned because I had just spent a lot of my career trying to create the metrics to help convince and provide the things of what we're doing, trying to convince. But I think what he meant really was that people really have to be in the mood for change. And unless they were right in the mood for changing, no matter what kind of metrics come up, people won't change. He also often said, while much of lean construction advocates for what seems like common sense, unfortunately, this sense is not common. Greg liked to say that a lot.
I think Greg's philosophy was based on a constant search for knowledge. And he viewed that search as more like grazing cattle than purposeful intention. that is just constantly going where the green grass is. To be open and aware that the opportunity for change or the opportunity to learn tends to present itself than being planned, I guess.
I believe Greg has had a huge impact on construction because, as I said, I started to work with Greg pretty early on, and in fact, very early on in those 24 years, almost 24 years, that I was with this large construction company, from which I retired, and very good company, DPR Construction, great people. And so, at first, companies like that didn't take Greg as seriously as he deserved to be taken because he had new ideas that we had no experience with that. So you really had to you had to be willing to trust Greg and Glenn Ballard and other people that were involved, sort of take them at their word. And people who, general contractors, people on my side, tend to be skeptics. They tend to be not the most trusting people because of their experience in the business. And so they're not the easiest audience, easiest customers for you. And so, so I saw Greg, and that's the way it started. But as we say, got to year 5 in my relationship with Greg, definitely more people were aware of lean construction and the last planner system. And then year 10, and all the way along, there were more people. I recently facilitated a webinar with 4 project superintendents from substantial construction companies, and the focus was on the last planner system, which Greg helped bring into the world. And all these companies were using it to one degree or another, not perfectly, not the way Greg would want them to, but they knew about the last planner and they were using it on their projects and spreading the word within their companies. And that's a pretty good, when project superintendents, who tend to be the most skeptical and the most unreceptive, kind of hard sells, tell you that you have made an impact on the industry. Greg impacted a lot of people in a positive way, sometimes very positively, sometimes negatively. I mean, we're all human, right? And so was Greg. But Greg was first genuinely curious about the world. I mean, really curious. And so that included other people. He was curious about other people and what they did and what they thought and how they saw the world. So, you could sense that from Greg that he wanted to know your story. And so it was a dialogue that you were in with Greg. And Greg was a very positive person. Very positive. He looked on the bright side, and he believed deeply in people, in humanity, as we'd say today. And so you felt that from Greg, that he had confidence in you. Well, if somebody has confidence in you, why, you sort of sit up a little straighter and and listen a little more, and you respond, and it becomes a virtuous cycle. So I think Greg had those qualities, and that's how he impacted people. People felt like he listened. I felt like he listened to me, that he had confidence in me, that I could do this thing that he was talking about. And so then you actually are emboldened to actually try that thing and do that thing. And then it turns out that, yes, you can do that thing and you feel better. And then there's maybe more that you can do and learn from Greg. So that Greg could actuate that dynamic. Greg, fairly early on in terms of lean construction, his work and what's called the Lean Construction Institute. And I was one of Greg's customers because I worked for a large general contractor. I was at that time a planner scheduler, and Greg had helped invent a technique for that was very different than what I knew, and seemed better and a lot more interesting and a lot more fun. So I met Greg that way, and Greg was basically a teacher for me. So I'm student, he's teacher. I am trying to understand what Greg is, telling me. And honestly, I think Greg must have thought, this guy is dense, because it took a while. He had to keep telling me this probably the same things different ways over and over again before I really got it. And that was not just in one meeting, that was over a period of time. And eventually, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. So that was how I first met Greg. That was the role that he was in. He was my guru. So he was driven to answer why. Greg really loved people. He was comfortable with people. So that's not always the case with really bright people. You can be really bright and introverted. Greg was not, he didn't seem like an introvert to me. So he was very bright. He could see relationships. He was very curious. And so those were, I think, the drivers for Greg. He was driven to answer the question why. And he wasn't afraid to talk to anybody if that could help him understand why. And then once he learned why, he was happy to share that with people. So if you put that package together, you have a very influential person that many of us just loved to be around. Was right, mostly. Greg was right. Okay? That's the one thing that people have to know about Greg. So when you sat there with your arms folded and you couldn't quite agree with Greg, I'll just say that Greg was right.
Hi, I'm Dick Beyer. The story of how I met Greg is in 2008, my partner Dan Fauché and I were the partnering representatives on the California Prison Healthcare Receivership. And Greg and Glenn were part of the team that was putting together the first IPD, $7 billion IPD. And Lean Construction Institute was part of that. Lean Construction Consulting, or whatever Greg was with, was part of that. So we met him on that program. And it was funny, after we had done a few of these partnering sessions, we were hanging around in the hallway with him and Bill Proctor, who ran that program. And Greg said, I really like how, he scratched his head and he did his thing, right? Takes his glasses off, squeezes his eyes, does all that. And he goes, I really like how you guys control the political space in the room. That's really awesome. We're having 300 people show up here next week. Would you like to help us? And Bill Proctor said, you know, Greg, that's a great idea. And Dan and I went, okay. And suddenly we went from being partnering consultants to being full-time facilitators for 2 years on the California prison healthcare receivership, which was an awesome time. And that's how I met Greg. And later on, Dan and I hired Emily Howell, his daughter, to work for us at CPR. And that's how we met Emily and got to know the family, and feel like I've been part of the family since then. And Glenn, along with numerous other folks who don't get much credit for, Todd Zabel and Iris Tomaline and others, Greg and Glenn, along with numerous other folks who don't get much credit for, Todd Zabel and Iris Tomaline and others, were really interested in this, in what they were calling lean construction, although they didn't necessarily believe it was like lean construction, like Toyota way necessarily. It was kind of a convenient way of referring to what had been happening at the International Group for Lean Construction, because they were part of that big group. And they decided to found an institute. And the idea of the institute was to be a think shop, a kind of study place where the big thinking could happen. We could have a journal and all the rest of that. And after CPR, Greg asked Dan and I to be on the board of directors. And so we were on the board of directors for about 1.5 years. And the institute itself was having some membership issues. I think there were like 15 members, and nobody paid their dues until Greg called them up and said, hey, you should pay your dues. So we had decided on the board that we should have a retreat. We went to Los Angeles. We hired somebody for $25,000 to do mission, vision, and goals. And $25,000 was about $11 more than they had in the bank at the time. And I remember going to Los Angeles and going, this mission, vision, and goal stuff, I really never believed in that. It always sounds like a weekend, and then you go back to doing what you're normally doing. But we had some actually deep discussions around what we needed. And the board determined we needed an executive director. And Hal Maycumber said, I think Dick should be that guy, because I had my own business and we had been pretty successful at creating the business. And I kind of had some ideas about stuff. And I went, well, thanks, Hal. That's awesome. And then other people were kind of going, well, should we like look around for somebody? And everybody said, no. So Greg said, no, we'll get Byron in there. He'll be fine. And so I got hired on part-time to be an interim executive director. The goal was to find an executive director to get the association, the institute, up and going in a kind of association way, with membership that's paid and all the rest of that stuff. That would have been handy. So, as I said, I was half-time doing that. And the goal was maybe find a real executive director like in 6 months. So 3 years later, we actually found somebody. But 3 years later, we had about $1 million in the bank. We had over 120 corporate members. The first thing I did as executive director was to raise the dues from $5,000 to $7,500. And Greg said, are you sure does that make monetary sense? I said, look, what you guys have here is gold. And people ought to recognize the value for it. And he said, oh, are we going to have to give away hats, stuff? And I said, I don't think we have to give away hats. This is an opportunity to change the way we build things in the world. And he went, okay. And so off we went. And Cynthia Zhao had been there helping out. And Shannon Heyer was the little bookkeeper who was helping out. And that was really the entire organization. There was a woman, Donna Pemberton, who kind of helped out a little bit with scheduling and stuff. But largely they had the Boulder Congress every year, where people got together in old sweaters that smelled like wood smoke and wore Birkenstocks and talked about lean construction and all kinds of cool stuff. And so we decided, so I got together with some of the other board members, Victor Sanvito, Chuck Greco of Lindbach Construction in Texas, and Will Lichtig, who is a really close friend of Greg's. Hopefully you've interviewed him already. But he was the guy that he wrote the first integrated form of agreement. He was a lawyer. Now he works for Bolt. So we got together with them, and right then the board of directors was still a bunch of consultants. And we decided that it just didn't make sense to have consultants. Victor Sambito said, we need a board that has people who wake up every day and their job depends on instituting and implementing lean construction in their company. So let's get rid of all the consultants. And George Zettel was on the board, Dan was on the board, and everybody said, fine. It was like one of those Russian show trials where people just pled guilty and away they went. And the board of directors went away. And we formed a board of directors that was really based on people whose jobs depended on it. And that was a huge turnaround for us. The next thing we did is Greg had not had much good luck with the Association of General Contractors because he really believed that everything that they were doing was pretty much wrong. And he was trying to convince them that it was wrong, and he was running at a very high speed into a very dense wall. And so I said, well, look, the first thing I think we have to do is we have to have an agreement with AGC and with AIA and with Design Build Institute of America and some of these big associations that we're not going to get in their way, that we're going to be the voice of lean. We need their support. They won't have to worry about lean construction. We'll do all that, but we won't sell a contract that's competing with them. We won't sell services that are different than what they're doing, and we'll help them, and we'll have them help us underwrite things. So Greg was pretty skeptical about that, and Will and I went off to negotiate a deal with them. And we called Greg and said, hey, we have this deal. They're going to give us money, and they're going to support us, and they're going to actually underwrite education. And he goes, really? Okay. He still wasn't completely convinced that that was the direction we needed to go. So his leadership in those days was, I think we called him the president or something. We probably should have called him the commissar, or the grand poobah, or the Greg. We could have just called him the Greg, and everybody would have known who he was. He continued to run the congresses. He continued to evangelize at a high level. But he wanted to write, and he wanted to talk, and he wanted to think about lean construction stuff. So we kind of freed him up to do that. And he would come in every once in a while, and he would say, well, so how are we doing? I said, well, I think we've gotten all the receipts out of that Folgers coffee can that Dana kept on the counter. And I think we're up to speed. I think we know where we're heading, and I think we're doing well. And so we had actually a really close relationship, but he was always afraid that LCI would turn into almost what it's turned into today. It's a very big evangelistic organization, but it's got 5,000 members. It has 10,000 people that go to the Congress every year, and it's very successful, but it is one of those institutes that kind of creates the momentum to stay alive itself. And when we were doing it, it was very much, I was on the road 4 times a month doing introductions to lean at different cities, and Greg was doing the same thing. He had his duck call with him, and he was famous for his duck call. That's how he got people quiet, got them back into the room, and he was mostly telling his stories. So when I think of Greg, I don't think of him as a consultant. Hal was more of a consultant, and he was in a consulting business with Hal. But he really wasn't a consultant. He was a guy who would sit in the back of the room at $500 an hour, and he'd listen to what you had to say, and then he'd tell a story about one of the projects that he'd been on, or someplace that he had been, that was just so compelling and just so over the top that everything you were talking about was knit into a ball that inevitably fell down a hill that led to you doing something different. And he was amazing that way. He almost brought me to tears with his stories sometimes. And one of my great regrets is I didn't get up to Idaho with my son, who's a videographer for the World Surf League, and sit on the front porch with Greg and capture those stories that we've missed. So I'm doing a podcast now, and my goal is to try to tell some of those stories, bring in people from our community. That it could never replace Greg, but every community needs a storyteller. And he was the great storyteller.
My name is Edward Potasic, Ed Potasic. I met Greg freshman year at Stanford when we were dorms next to each other. And then, as I recall, he and I were sneaking over to the ATO house before rush to meet them and probably drink beer. I can't remember, but I've known him since that time. Uh, we went through Stanford together, and then I graduated, and I think he stayed another year at Stanford. I think he got a master's in construction management or something at the university after I left. I was then in grad school, and a while later, I ended up through the lesser of all evils, Navy OCS. And then we kind of maintained contact. And then when I got orders, first orders to Vietnam area, I think he contacted me or something because he was already there. So we sort of communicated back and forth, and that's what I learned what he was doing there. I still remember the comments of getting kicked out of an aircraft and rolling out of the back in Quezon because the plane wouldn't stop. They just rolled and threw people out and got the hell out of there. I remember that very much. And then after, when I was there, he was in Thailand. And I tried to go visit him. I couldn't. And then I went to Thailand in the Navy and went to some places and learned about what he was doing and with the team. And then after that, he became, which was mentioned today, he became admiral's aide to the admiral in charge of the Seabees and the whole Navy. He was he was the aide to the admiral. And then I got assigned to admiral's staff in Norfolk, Virginia. So we communicated again and then I got out of the Navy. I kind of lost track of him until maybe 10 years ago when I learned more about lean. I actually went to 2 seminars he invited me to, but I didn't, I'm not involved in construction at all, so I couldn't attend more, but I'm now totally amazed at what was the success, the worldwide success of what it is now. You may try to refer them to some business. So I'm very happy and honored to be here.
Ms. George Zettel. I'm with Turner Construction, and I got to meet Greg in the process of working on projects at Sutter Hill. That's how we first met. Construction Institute, I was really privileged. My first encounter was in Northern California. I asked Greg, I said, what's this coordinator meeting is basically what we were calling it at the time. And he said, well, it's just, some of your peers from the other companies, construction companies that get together with the client, and they just talk about how things are going with their lean transformation. How are the projects going and the tools that we're using and things like that. I went to the first meeting, and it was kind of in a bar, and we're gathered around these tables, and this is my first meeting, but it's clear that they had two meetings before, and the conversation started with, well, what did we decide to do at the last meeting? And this conversation was going on for like 15, 20 minutes, like, well, you said, or he said, or she said, or I thought you were gonna blah, blah, so it was like nobody had a clue of how they were going to take some action to move this thing and to actually take advantage of this group of practitioners. And so I just, one of my colleagues was, and I were at the same edge of the table. We couldn't believe what was going on. And so I just raised my hand. I said, you know what, how about for the sake of the next meeting, I take meeting minutes. And so I just volunteered to take meeting minutes. And I knew the power of the scribe, that, what I wrote down and how I saw who was going to do something. I gave everybody the chance, to agree to they were going to do something or not. So I started taking meeting minutes. Well, a couple more meetings later, it was clear that they were looking to me to lead this group. And that basically spawned what we now call communities of practice. And so Greg, over time, he would call me up and he said, this thing you have going on in Northern California is working really, really great. People were coming from all over the country to observe what we were doing in our community of practice meetings, which was kind of a really safe zone for everybody in the industry. We had owners, designers, contractors, trade contractors, general contractors, excuse me. And it really became this forum to share what was working and best practices and case studies, and to openly share what's working, even though we may have competitors in the room, which was unheard of. And that was some of the first things that people said was, I can't believe you're airing your dirty laundry, and then DPR's airing their dirty laundry, and you have all these other contractors, and and it was basically that kind of an environment. And Greg was really happy with how that was all going. And so other people in other regions wanted to start a community of practice. And so we would, help them and give them the lessons learned, standard agendas and formats, and kind of the breakup. And one day, another one of those Saturday calls, Greg said, we're having a challenge with this community of practice. It happened to be in the Northwest. And it just was not having the dynamics that we wanted. It was not a safe zone. And one of the reasons was it was really being run by an individual that was a consultant. And so there was this conflict of interest, basically, or a lack of trust that the community would go and meet there, and that they knew they were just being gathered up so that they could be called upon for becoming a client. And Greg, asked me, how can we solve this? And so we brainstormed and worked on some things with relationships that I had in the Northwest. We were able to change how that thing we made a transition, and it became much more robust and healthier. So it was things like that I was able to help with Greg with the Lean Construction Institute. He asked me to be on his board as we started to do a transition. So I thought that was a real honor to be able to be in that atmosphere and brainstorm on how we were going to help move this industry forward and help keep he was making a transition with respect to, the work that needed to still be done, and who can lead this so that he can do other things and move on to what could be a retirement kind of scenario. And we did all that. And the other thing that I wanted to share around this whole Lean Construction Institute thing was we were having conversations with how do we recognize the things that Greg and Glenn would do, because at that time we were always putting the work that they were doing as a team, really, Glenn and Greg. And one of the ideas that we came up with is that Turner has a relationship with the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., where we actually have an endowment to the National Building Museum to create what we call the Henry C. Turner Innovation Award. And so we would collaborate with the museum on putting people forward to win this award. And so our desire was to recognize Greg and Glenn with that award. And so my colleagues and I were working on this, and for whatever reason, the transition that LCI was in at the time, they felt that the award was going to be to LCI, not to Greg and Glenn. And it really struck me, but I want to just go on record that our Henry C. Turner Innovation Award that was to LCI was really meant for Greg and for Glenn. And that's how we tried to recognize the contributions and the impact that he and his colleague Glenn had made to the industry. I can speak from the perspective that I have as Turner Construction is the largest general contractor in the United States and links around the world as well. And everything that we're doing with respect to Lean, we would not have done or known at all without Greg. So his impact to the greater industry, has been profound. And I can say, that lots of the things that we're doing are now because of what Greg had taught me or his coaches have taught me. And then we started practicing and employed them on our projects. And he had a way of staying in touch with me. Some of the things that we would do, I would get Saturday phone calls from Greg, and we both knew that that was, our time to both unwind. And he kind of saw it as some secret scheming that we could do in order to advance lean and lean thinking in our industry, which was badly needed. So I was happy to collaborate with him in that kind of a mechanism. And in some perspectives, he was always working with the customer, and Turner was, the contractor or the supplier. And so Greg's insights would help us better understand what the customers were doing and thinking, and allowed us to do a better job of application or implementation. And so I think his efforts in the industry have allowed us to be better and for us to do a deeper dive. I think it might sometimes it's not really known what Greg has done to impact some of the paths that these huge companies have been taking. I just know that he has changed people's lives because of it. So people that I have coached that were extremely skeptical, even negative or argumentative, after a while have come around, and they are now firm believers and they're practitioners. And I like to tell the story of Ed Kostanovich was one of my students. So the things that Greg had taught me or his coaches had taught me from him, I was passing on to Ed Kostanovich, a superintendent on very large jobs in Southern California for Turner. And Ed would come. Ed was initially very skeptical and very vocal about that, and we worked together on some hospital projects in Long Beach, and he started to see things improve and change, and actually the quality of his life and the staff around him. And so he became a go-to practitioner, and I would actually take Ed Kostanovich with me to talk to his peers who were also skeptics. And I called him up the other day just to see how he was doing. And he goes, "Do you remember that time we went to that data center job and those people, they just didn't want anything to do with that?" I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And this was him telling his story. Well, he had retired, and so he called me up and he said, "I just wanted you to know, George, that you changed my life." The things that we did. And so that's the legacy that Greg has with the whole industry, because I can tell you countless stories of, just like Ed Kostanovich, of people from coast to coast where we've had this kind of a transformation with the individuals and then therefore the projects and the teams that they were on. And I don't think that can be underestimated. Back with respect to where I first saw his name, and it turns out that when I was in undergraduate school and at Michigan Tech University, I was taking all these academic classes, calculus and physics and chemistry, and I just needed something that had to do with our business. And because all that stuff was just wearing me down, and I would go to the library and I would read the American Society of Civil Engineers Construction Journal. And I was just flipping through the topics, and all of a sudden this topic kept coming over and over in every journal that I would read about time-lapse studies in construction. And it was amazing because it was storytelling, and it was looking at the problems that we were having in our industry, and allowed me, as a engineer in training, so to speak, to get up to speed. Well, lo and behold, it was Greg Howell. And I didn't know that until I started meeting him, doing consulting work and in the projects that we were on, that he was actually this bridge. And so there's a huge legacy and connection that Greg and I had by me first reading all of those journals and hearing his stories about the problems in our industry and what he actually really discovered. The truth when we were observing what was going on in projects was much different than what we thought we were trying to solve. And so Greg taught me that, the power of the observation. From there, we had our first workshop together, actually in Washington, D.C. We were learning I was, asked by Turner to be the lean person. And so it took this workshop, and it was basically him and Glenn Ballard. We were talking about the parade of trades, and we did the parade of trades exercise, and we did the airplane exercise. And those were just really aha moments. And he talked about them as being aha moments, and that it's a fundamental that if we didn't understand what was going on in those simulations, that we really didn't have an understanding of what we could do differently. And so the parade of trades for me just became this fundamental for my own understanding, and then applying that, and then using it to get people who I was coaching to understand these fundamentals. And so to this day, this is a bedrock of when I engage with a team or when I engage with leaders, is you need to understand the parade of trades. So one of the things that I did with Greg was help with the Lean Construction Institute community of practice. And one of the things that we always tried to do is, what are the basics when someone came as a first time? What did we do with them? And so we quickly understood we had to do the parade of trades exercise. And one of the things that I coaxed Greg to do was to coach 8 or 10 people in Northern California on how he managed and ran the parade of trades exercise. And so we actually had this document that we started sharing kind of some standard work on how do you coach and instruct people in the parade of trades exercise. And I just felt such a huge bond with Greg with respect to how the care that he took to explain the why behind the exercise, and the care that he took to answer people's questions, which would be at some point questions that we would need to respond to, and do it in a way that Greg was doing it. So it was just an awesome experience. And so the power of observation and the parade of trades were solid things that Greg really helped me and advance my career, clearly.
He was also a connector in the sense that if you had a question about some specific topic or a person, that he would be able to point you in the right direction. He might not know directly, but he would know someone who would know, or someone who would know someone, right? So, and he had that kind of encyclopedic memory as well. But also, industry professionals would contact him, and sometimes they would be contacted by him in strange ways. So, this is a letter from Fritz Gebauer. He's German, as you might imagine, and it's a letter about how he met Greg and how Greg impacted his life. So I might not get through it without crying. So, dear Dana and family, dear friends of Greg, sadness is inevitably part of a day of memory of a beloved person when this person has already left us. But there is also joy that Greg has planted in our hearts and that continues to live there based on memories of humor, friendship, wisdom, and humanity that Greg radiated. I'd like to share with you one example. It goes back to the day when Greg and I met for the first time. 2003, Fortaleza, north of Brazil, a conference on lean construction. There are 2 international speakers, Greg and me. Hardly any conference has ever had a main speaker with less knowledge of its topic than me at the time. Says, so I will depart from the letter just for a moment. I mean, the reputation that Fritz had in Brazil at the time was, as a result of his consulting work there, was he was Mr. Productivity. So if Gebauer said it, it was so, right? And he had written a book, and the book was still just being rolled out, and the publisher wanted to have a presentation of the book for marketing purposes in the North, as well as in the South, where Fritz had done his work. So, so Greg spoke right before me and presented some vocabulary unknown to me, a new language. And with every new language, you discover a new world. While listening to Greg's talk, I compared my conventional ways of project improvement with his new world, and from minute to minute, I sank deeper and deeper into my chair. Was I really to present outdated stuff? What could I ever tell Greg? I pushed myself, remembering that my project in the south of Brazil was quite successful, even with using conventional methods. So boldly, I got up and presented my talk. However, I was only half concentrated while Greg's new language resounded in my head. Networks of commitments, increase of relatedness, tightly coupled learning with action, and other mysterious but fascinating terms. During the subsequent panel, Greg was sitting beside me, and when the coffee break was called, he asked me to stay with him on the podium. The next 10 minutes changed my life. Greg gave me a short introduction to Lean. And it's the way he did it that I wish to share with you, his friends, who will understand what I mean. He did not utter a single word of superiority, and his criticism was clear, but at the same time encouraging. Fritz, he said, your methods are good, even successful, but they could still be improved. You could be better. Then, before he began with his teaching, he pointed out some of the interesting points of my presentation. Because he does not want to appear to be disrespectful and disregarding of somebody else's work, right? He wanted to have me in a positive mood before he brought forward what I could eventually learn in Lean. I then, after that lecture, Greg must have recognized my shining eyes. So he accepted my subsequent invitation to Germany. The visit took place only a couple of months later, when he offered the first Lean course in Germany ever, followed by my first attendance to a LCI conference in Seattle. There, Greg introduced me to the group of graybeards and therefore gave me the opportunity to meet the people and personalities that further enriched my life. I am sure most of them are here today. Greg and I founded the German Lean Construction Institute, and after a slow start, this is striving now under the leadership of my successor. And a number of my doctoral students act now as Lean consultants in Germany and throughout Europe. Dear Greg, I wish you could see what has been achieved in Germany. To a great extent, the result of your doing. We are grateful here, as so many other friends are, in countless countries around the world. The International Group for Lean Construction was formed in 1993. Greg wasn't there, but at the next one, which was in Santiago, Chile, he and I wrote 4 papers together, and we just swapped. And we said, you be the first author, then swap, right? So I was first author on 2, and he was first author on 2, and that really set it really defined this a method for managing production on projects called the last planner system. And Greg was right in the middle of that. And for the next, let's see, I think there were 3 major consulting projects and 1 research project for the Construction Industry Institute from that time through to 1999. That really made a huge contribution to the industry, because this was by way of, we had designed the system, but you had to test it, right? Because you had to prove its utility, and in testing, we found ways of refining it and making it better. And one of those projects was, Greg invited me into it. I think he was the principal investigator on the Construction Industry Institute project that involved the spool piping. So that we're looking at design, engineering, fabrication, delivery, and installation, right? And so we've got that middle part, and well, the middle and the end. Someone else was working on design, engineering. And when we brought together the team, it consisted of the big heavyweights in the industry. So owners would include Texaco, Union Carbide, Shell, and such and such. And then on the builder side, the contractor side would be a Bechtel, a Bronnerud, And so it was the heavyweights of the industry. And we said, well, what we're interested in is, do you have any projects that have high piping installation productivity and low inventory of piping on hand? And they said, well, all our projects do that. We said, oh, that's really good. That's great. Let's go see. None of their projects did that. I mean, zero. We made a little graphic, and we called it the empty quarter down here, which is where their projects should have been if what they had said was true. And so that really rang some bells, right? And our basic understanding was that, and I experienced this directly in a way that I will explain, but that construction, frustrated at the inability to get fabricated pipe spools when they wanted them, continued to put pressure on engineering to issue those sooner, right? Okay, or to get them from the fabricator sooner. And of course, the fabricator couldn't do it until they had designed the spools, right? So had the spools designed. And, and it was pretty clear that the cause for the variation, the variability in that process was a result of them squeezing engineering too tight. So they would say, so at some point they kept pushing it back, pushing it back, pushing it back, and they began to eat into muscle, right? So it had no buffer, right? No slack. And so, just the normal ways of things, you're going to have some variation, right? And that builds up and builds up and builds up, right? And so we learned that the fabrication process for piping was quite reliable if they had information and materials to work with, right? Which is pretty much the story we've learned everywhere else. Everyone can do their job perfectly if everyone else did their job perfectly. But it's a team sport. It's not that we try to play it like it's individuals, right? Well, it may not be best, but it's really good. He said, because when we first met, his focus, his role in the project where we met was methods improvement, and that involved capturing work processes on tape or on film at the time, Super 8 film, and he said to me, "Okay, here's something you really need to understand. The first people to see the film are the people in it. Otherwise, they're going to be blamed because it's going to look bad, right? Almost always, right? And if you don't give them an opportunity to explain why they did what they did the way they did it, then they're going to be the scapegoats, and nobody else will learn anything, right? And I've tried to hold to that one. I failed to do that one time, and it turned out I got somebody fired. And I never failed. I never failed again.
I'm Hal Makeover. I met Craig in 77, maybe 76. I was independently bringing lean to the construction industry. Didn't know anything about what construction institute, and as a result of it, through a couple of connections, our company, the Needham Company in Colorado, started getting interested in what Greg and Glenn were doing. And we became one of the 6 sponsors of LCI in 1987.
I'm John Strickland from the Portland, Oregon area, and I've known Greg for a long time, starting probably in 1997, 1998, as the Lean Construction Institute was formed, and I was working on some projects in the Portland area, and those first meetings were in Portland, and I got associated there. So I started talking to Greg when we described the LCI as a tribe of like-minded malcontents. And it was a small, I'm sure, a much smaller event than we'll have here today. And I think actually, I might have actually gone back even deeper, that Greg had a time-lapse camera business. And the group I was with in Boise, Idaho in 1980 or 1981 bought one of those systems, and we used it. And so I became associated with Greg's work way back as early as 1980 on a project at Boise State University. Well, LCI was very different in the early days, and it wasn't this highly structured, formal organization. It's a very good organization to go into, but pretty much we get together, and Greg would summon the meeting with a duck call. So that's how he would tell us it's all time to come back. And one of my favorite speaking gifts is one of my friends gave me a duck call to use on my meeting sessions. I've actually never pulled it out, but great stories. You see up there, Greg would be in his flannel shirt and his chukka boots and his khaki pants, and very informal. He was always up there helping us think about what was really going on. A huge number of us that kind of banded together, and there's Greg touched countless people, but those people are just an enormous network. And I recall them talking to Greg and the Glenn Ballard and others, and if we ever actually got mentioned in Engineering News Record, that would be a major event. We got a magazine mentioned, of course, now where the organization is very prominently mentioned. So been a huge geometric progression from Greg and what he's done. It's definitely affected a corner of the market. The vast majority of construction in the U.S. around the world is still done traditionally, but we're making a really important change. And I sometimes have been comparing it to electric vehicles and conventional vehicles, that the lean IPD approach is very much like EVs. No one's going to stop making diesel trucks tomorrow. But this is a very important alternate way to deliver projects that will appeal to a lot of people. We've learned quite a bit, and it was really odd when I first met Greg. Actually, I was familiar with some of the progressive management techniques, but when I heard about this meeting, I was confusing lean construction with the people who are really driving down prices through supply chain management. And I thought okay, I'll go see who these guys are. And so I was actually probably a little ornery in the first sessions we were having there. And then Greg tells a story or two about how projects were done in Africa and how they introduced buffers. And I go, he's one of my people here. We're on the same side. We're trying to do the same things, and he's got a good way to explain what's really going on. It's helping me understand what I'm seeing. So I think that was his main gift, is he had a way of seeing what was really going on, explaining it through stories and various other things. So it was kind of obvious then. And once you see what the problem really is, you take a whole different approach to solving it.
Sure. So I'm Kate Spohr, and I've known Greg for a very long time. First as a mentor, he was my boss, and then later just as a friend for very many years. And I watched, I was around when Emily was born. I have watched the whole evolution, and so yeah, it's nice to be able to talk about him a little bit in person. So it's easy to have vivid memories of him, but I did select one. So I've known Greg since 1978. So my memory is of our first meeting. So this was just a few years after Greg had gotten his master's degree from Stanford, and he had just taken over the management of this small company called Time-Lapse, which was a manufacturer of cameras, time-lapse cameras and projectors, primarily used by engineers in studying time-based phenomenon such as traffic patterns or construction flows of large construction jobs. And I was just 23 at the time and had just moved to California from the East Coast and started my graduate studies at Stanford. So I needed a part-time job pretty quickly because I realized my costs were going to be a lot higher than I thought. And Greg needed sort of a general assistant. So that's what brought us together. So my memory is of going out to Time-Lapse, this sleepy little manufacturing company, very small, out in Mountain View as a 23-year-old. and thinking, okay, I hope this, goes well. This is, my maybe I'll get hired. I just wanted to be one and done, kind of get a job. I didn't really care much what it was. And there's Greg, and I just from the very start, I was just like, who is this guy? Like, he is not like a boss. He is not giving me any, formal boss employee kinds of questions. He's just talking about stuff, and he's hilarious and entertaining. And I don't know, I just feel totally comfortable with this guy, but is he even really a manager of a company? Can he pay me? These were the questions that went through my mind. And he's just completely different from any boss I had ever had or imagined having. He's funny, self-deprecating. He had this very subversive little laugh he would throw in there at the end of some pronouncement he would make. And but when it came to his work and to time lapse, he became very serious, and he was like, this is really game-changing kind of technology to use time lapse photography to really study deeply, these patterns in how people behave on large construction projects. And that was really his love, was studying better methodology for construction. He really talked about his dreams for time lapse and how he really wanted to make this little tiny company a success. And he called it, he said, time lapse is my sandbox. This is my sandbox. I just have a lot of fun here. I love it. And he said, so, if you think this all sounds like fun, you could join the sandbox. And that was his way of offering me the job. Basically, I was hired, very, very, very non-conventional. And I never imagined that part-time gig, which really had no definition to it, he would hire me later as a full-time employee. He would actually become the best mentor, I'd had in my 40-year career. And I am very grateful to him for all he did for me in launching my career. Yeah.
Mike Caston. I grew up in northern Colorado and joined a very progressive construction company. And in that experience as a young engineer, had a chance to use time-lapse photography that was developed out here in the Stanford area with Professor Henry Parker. And some 10 years later, I decided I really enjoyed that so much that I wanted to get into consulting around improving construction work methods. My career had advanced very quickly, and the higher I got, the further away from the work I was. And the only thing I loved about construction was the work and nothing about subcontracts or submittals or anything else. So I called Henry Parker back. I mean, we had been in touch for off and on for all those 10 years. And he said, you need to get in touch with a guy by the name of Greg Howell, who is now running our company. And it turned out the company that I had started with was doing a seminar in Denver. And the guy who replaced me with the time-lapse program was leading it. And Greg came out to join that. And we sat together in that conference the first time we met. We were solving the propositions he was putting up on film faster than he could get anybody else to answer the questions, which quite frankly really irritated him. And we found out that afternoon that he and I both loved fly fishing, that we had both played rugby, and that we really liked good food. And so we hit it off immediately. In fact, that night we hit a couple rugby bars in Denver that I had frequented when I was playing rugby. And we began to communicate, and before long we found ourselves working on many of the same things, and we began to we oftentimes would be working together on client projects, and it was happening so fast that it really is just now that I'm taking the time to reflect on how fast all that happened, because very early on we got a project in Honolulu, Hawaii, where we in 1 week turned that job completely around. I mean, not us, but we figured out what the project team could do. And we realized that there was huge opportunity in what we were doing, and initially focused on improving the methods that individual crews were using. And over time, needless to say, that morphed into working on turning around projects, and then eventually Greg and Glenn began to work on turning around the industry, and I began to work on enterprise-wide crew-centered construction kinds of things that were an attempt to create a project production system that was consistent throughout an entire construction company. And so that encapsulates about almost 50 years in that little time frame.
The most important thing about Greg, I think, is that he never thought inside the box, right? He was always lateral thinking. He always had a new idea. He always had something different. And the world is pretty short of people who think differently. And the world is pretty short of people who create new ideas and think laterally and sort of think outside the box. And Greg was one of the few. All right, I've been fortunate to meet some others, but nobody got anywhere near Greg when it came to sort of creative lateral thinking and new ideas. That's his characteristic. That was his characteristic for me.
The things that, just on a very personal level, that I remember coming to one of the IGLC conferences. And when I went there, it was purely to hang out with Jeannie, who is Glenn Ballard's wife, and Dana, if she was there, just to play. I was there to play. And but I remember walking into this space in Denmark and having him see me and just turning to me with such kind of warmth and welcome. And, I came over and he just kind of scooped his arms around me. I just felt so like he stopped everything he was doing, which I think was probably telling some stories with some beers, right? But, it was like, oh, Nancy. And then he just did that. And I felt so, so held, which is a really nice feeling, especially for someone who, and I can be very outgoing, but I have a certain level of social anxiety, and so here I am coming into a room and I don't know any of the other people except Greg. And it was just, I got you kind of feeling. And I think, just listening to people today, I got that impression that a lot of people felt that way a lot of the time, that there was something about how he would make this space for you and really be completely absorbed in this exchange with you. I kind of got that sense, especially at that last little video of his nephew talking about taking him downstairs into his office and talking about poetry and talking about, and that had really had so much meaning for this young man, that he made that video when his uncle died. And so I think it's that real kind of laser focus on, this is who I'm talking to, this is who I'm connecting with, this is who I'm interested in holding space for right now, and that's what I'm doing right now. And that's what I'd always kind of get from him. I think that there were a few factors, and probably more, but a few that I can identify. One is, I think that people really generally speaking, crave that sense of somebody being attuned to them and understanding them, making an effort to understand them. He was also humble, and you didn't hear him constantly tooting his own horn about I did this and I did that. Not at all. And I'm sure that most of us were sitting in that room today who'd known him for years and years and still were like, he did? He did that? Oh, I didn't know that. Because he wasn't somebody that was, talking about that all the time. Humility, it was that attunement, it was that really that sense of pleasure in other people. And a quality that he had that I really appreciated is his generosity. And generosity in terms of inclusion, like, hey, you come too, that kind of generosity in terms of actually, like, I was this kind of underpaid person working in early childhood education, and they would invite me on really wonderful ski vacations, that kind of thing, and just not make any big deal about it at all. But so it didn't he'd had these wonderful qualities, but it was never like, look at me and how wonderful I am. It just was, that's who he is, that's what he does, and he likes you, or sometimes he doesn't even know you, like like the soldier in the airport story, and that he just scoops you up, because you need a place to stay that night, kind of. Yeah, it just felt effortless to hang out. And he always wanted to help.
One of the most cherished memories I have of Greg is his listening and his really ability to empathize and just really put himself in the context that and setting that one is talking about. And the age difference, he's 1 year older than my mother, and I told him that once, and he said, so. and so it was he just the age was not a factor for him, whether he um, took you as a friend or took you as a mentor even, or learned from you, or taught you, or it just was not a factor. And he just respected you for yourself and not for your age or your what you've accomplished. And so I was going through a rough patch, and he at one of the conferences or a forum, I think it was a lean design forum, we went together after the forum, and I think we spent 3 hours or maybe 4 hours talking. And he talked to me about how they make beer in that particular place that we went to. And we talked about his time in the with the CBs, and he would just bring the things that I was talking to him about into these anecdotes that he had, and it was just a wonderful evening, and I just don't forget that ever, and feel that it was a blessing that I spent the time with him to do that. So so much of that time. Greg, his use of metaphors was just incredible and timely. The way he wove in stories with teaching a concept and trying to make principles much more accessible was just fascinating to me, and I don't think it's easy to emulate that. I think it's a gift that Greg had. I just aspire to it, and I was sharing a metaphor with him once, and he said, sometimes metaphors can conceal as much as they reveal, and it was quips like that really always made me think, and he it wasn't just professional things that I would learn from him about. It could be personal things, or it could be a dispute or a conflict with a colleague, something related to my career as a faculty member, and I needed his insights, and I would both take counsel from him and Glenn, and they had different styles, and Greg would tell me sometimes that being right will get you second place many times, or in many of the cases, and I would debate that with him a little bit, and then I would kind of understand the wisdom. He was so wise, and the indecision is the best way to flexibility. Something along those lines. So what I've learned from him is really how meticulous he was in going back to first principles on a topic, and really dissecting it and breaking it apart, but he had to really put it back together so that it makes sense. So it was not enough to just break it down. How to put it back together, or you study it in both modes, and the analysis and the synthesis, and that has really given me a lot of insights and ideas, and really the stamina to continue to work in lean construction, and just the passion in this area was really something he passed on as he and Glenn really had this amazing way of completing each other and passing this passion and making it look so simple. The best piece of advice Greg gave me, really, there's a lot to choose from. So I would say one of the best pieces of advice that he gave me was saying, he told me that nothing paid him back as much as what he gave others for free. And it really resonated and stuck with me. And of course, it speaks to his generous and his giving and his desire to develop others and take them along with him. That was just how he and Glenn Ballard operated. But just this advice that nothing paid him back as much as what he gave others for free. And I've tried it, and he's right. And it's one of those that I always remember and think about. It's so he had these. It's so counterintuitive with when you feel that you have something and you want to you give it away almost. And he was really good at looking at these things in a completely different perspective, and that's why they were so successful together, him and Glenn, in really changing the conversation in the construction industry and transforming it, and the type of research that they were promoting. So it really all has to do with this way of really looking at things in a counter intuitive way.
He loved to provoke. There was another dinner at the Howells with a community organizer, the Albuquerque Interfaith, a guy by the name of Tim McCluskey. And they wanted to get us together because I have a community development background and we have different models. And along the way, Greg kept asking questions to which I was trying to be ameliorative of my wife, who was a little more more incisive and sharp tongue. At one point said, "That's a bunch of bullshit." And Tim lights up. And so my wife, Martha, and Tim were like, for the rest of it. And Greg was kind of, "Hey, and we get it going." And at the end of the meeting, and at the end of dinner, as we're going out the door, Tim turns to us and he says, "That wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be." So, I mean, it was like there was an enlivenment. There was that's a word, or a sense of energy, a positive energy for allowing people from different points of view to really engage or just to stoke the fire a little bit. And I'm grateful to him for those learnings and for our business contacts, because he really got me into a whole genre or market sector of work, which is construction partnering, which was a big movement in the 90s and aughts. But I learned from him a number of things: his penchant for lateral thinking and his sheer ballsiness on things. It actually happened. It started with the first time I ever met him. And I met Greg through Dana. Dana was really concerned about schools and parent engagement and good curriculum. And the whole idea of how people talk together, talk with each other was became really important to know. And so the idea of facilitation, the third party process guide became big. So a mutual friend of ours and I had just conducted a 2-day training on facilitation methods, and we were at dinner at the Howells. That's where I met Greg. And we were, so over dinner, we seemed to hit it off pretty well. And right in the middle of dinner, Greg starts saying, I really need your help. And I said, oh yeah, what is it? He says, well, my daughter, so this is Emily, she had just started 6th grade at Wilson Middle School. And she says, oh, there's really this gang activity on campus or crime concerns that parents are really up in arms. So I ran a meeting last week. And no sooner had I said my name than people started yelling at me saying, why are you here? Who the heck are you? Why should we listen to you, kind of thing. So he says, so I was reduced to just taking notes on a flip chart, and which was precisely the right thing to do with this emotional crowd. He says, but now they're having a follow-up meeting next week, and I really need some help. And could you come and help me? And I say, this would be like throwing gasoline on fire. They don't know me from Adam. He says, oh yeah, but could you please come? Please come. So I said, sure. So we get to this meeting. There are like 100 people packed into this little library, like hanging from the stacks practically. And this is the way he introduced me. He goes, well, good evening. I'm Greg Howell. And last meeting, we had a pretty interesting meeting, and we're glad you came back. And in the meantime, I met somebody who's supposed to know something about this stuff. And so I've invited him along to lead the meeting. And I know you don't know him or anything, but why don't we do it this way? We'll give him 10 minutes. And then if you don't like him, then like the Gong Show, we'll pull him off. Then he turns to me, he goes, you're on. So it was great. There was a story he told, this ballsy, this stuff. There was a story he told about a speech he gave to the AGC chapter in Cincinnati just after the Bengals lost the Super Bowl in '89, when Joe Montana made one of his famous last-minute drives, scored with 30 seconds left. And you have to understand, this is the early 90s, so it was kind of fresh. And he talks about how he's the speaker before him starts lauding the Bengals and talking about how wonderful their season was, and kind of gave the best case scenario for the good loser kind of thing. So Greg, he says, and so here's our keynote speaker, Mr. Greg Howell. Greg gets up. He says, thank you for that introduction and extended remarks on the Bengals. And while you were speaking, I was reminded of a famous saying by the great coach Vince Lombardi, who said, show me a good loser and I'll show you a loser. And then he goes, and they never invited me back. So this characterized our relationship. This kind of, we both laughed at that sort of stuff, which was, so that was great to hit it off. And the thing about facilitation for him, he met, you may be speaking with Vic Ortiz at some point, but he related to me a couple times a great story how Vic really demonstrated to him the power of that third party process guide or facilitator. When in a very complex project, I don't know the name of it, it had devolved, the conversation began and quickly devolved into an attack on one of the subcontractors. And Greg was getting increasingly impatient. He was a consultant to one of the other guys and kind of indirectly involved. And he thought, they're not really getting to the matter here. It's the project that was in trouble. That's why. And at the first break, he rushes up to Vic and says, you know, you got to move on quickly. And Vic said, no, I think we need to slow it down. And that counterintuitive approach opened up a space after the break for the guy under attack to finally reveal the enormous pressure he was under because of supply chain issues. And it was, he was in trouble, not through any fault of his own. And he was like a week away from the bondsman calling everything in. So the meeting turned 180 degrees from attacking to figuring out how they could help support this guy so that the entire project could succeed. So that idea of that really listening carefully and knowing what the timing is and what the questions are to probe and how to create a space for the best conversation to happen. He said, oh, okay, that works. So that's kind of how we got, and what we began to do is we did there was a movement in the late 80s and 90s and the aughts called partnering in the construction profession, which was basically a response to the rising number of claims on jobs. As contracts got thicker to answer previous problems, that was just more things to fight about. So as problems got more complex and the contracts got more complex, well, there are more opportunities for people to start fighting. So partnering was saying, why don't we just get together ahead of time? In addition to the pre-con, let's have a meeting where we all promise to be partners. And most of those meetings were, we would characterize them as moralistic exhortations to be better people. You know, let's be partners and maybe do a Myers-Briggs thing and this sort of thing. We tried to characterize it more as a an opportunity for a dialogue to really talk about the various and varying and the range of objectives that each party has. Because even though you think there's only one objective on a project, there are actually a number of objectives. Each party has its own really priorities. So we talked about how are we going to, let's create some mutual indicators of project success in addition to whatever's on paper in the contract. So Greg, to his credit, would cast what partnering as a partial solution on the way to redesigning the way production happens on jobs, the whole system of production. So it aligned with a lot of what he was doing with Glenn Ballard on the last planner stuff and then the lean construction stuff. And so we did a whole bunch of these partnering meetings on jobs. I learned a whole bunch of other things he would do. This lateral thinking thing I mentioned, he would bring in, so you got the facilitation, you got the construction management issues. He's got his stop action analysis of what's happening on jobs. But also he's got his CB experience that he would tap into because he was in the Navy, of course. And one of the stories he would tell at our partnering meetings is that he recalled one of the colonels that would run projects in Thailand. And they would get a whole bunch of folks together from different branches of the different services and of the service and then different levels of superiority, whoever's superior, rank. And so what he would do, so you get all these people around the table ahead of the job and he'd start the meeting and he would push this little alabaster bowl out to the middle of the table. He'd say one word. Say insignias. And people had to literally take their insignias off their epaulets and put them in the bowl. And then he would hold it. And it was a tangible signal that for this meeting, we're going to try to operate without sense of rank and or position on the job so that we could have a frank discussion. And at the end of the meeting, you'd push the bowl back out they would say, insignias. And the joke would always be, this is not an opportunity for promotion. So you had to grab your own. And he said, and I guess maybe apocryphally, I guess a couple times you'd have instances where a junior person in the middle of the meeting would say, that's the stupidest damn thing I've ever heard. And then you have to sit up and say, sir. So, everybody still knew who the major was and who the sergeant was and everything like that. But anyway, it was great. So that sort of set up the whole idea for the partnering thing. And I was just trying to figure out all the range of partnering meetings we did. We did a thing with, it was on a toll road in Southern California. And the project manager had a real incentive, tangible. I guess if he finished sufficiently under budget on time, you get $1 million bonus. So he was interested in making sure that we were all partners on this thing. So we did these meetings, and this one, because there were like 70 people or something, and we operated on a stage above the folks, and we had this. What we would do for our ideas with this project, indicators of project success, we would do what we called a consensus workshop, where we would have people write there. We'd have small tables of cross randomized tables. So you have different professions working together, and they'd say, what would success look like on this job for you? And we'd put them on big Post-its or half sheets of paper, put them up on what we call a sticky wall. We'd spray it with spray them out. And then we sort things out and have a discussion along the way. So this would be a different level, a different kind of conversation than we're normally used to. So this one, we had a 22 foot wide, long sticky wall. And at that point, before we moved to ripstop nylon, this was all paper. It was a big construction paper thing. And so I remember to construct this, we were over at Greg and Dana's house on Aliso in Albuquerque. And we had to put plastic tape around the back of the perimeter of the sticky wall so we could put it up and we could take it down and it wouldn't just rip, or dissolve. Anyway, and I just remember us being in the living room and of his house and having to, we have it partly rolled up because it wasn't 25 feet long, but it was through the dining room, we got most of it. But we were hands and knees and putting the tape around it. And then when we got there, we put it up there and we were like showmen for this one, we were kind of on stage. And that worked pretty well. Others were a little more low key. But Greg's wry humor and our willingness to, just a little bit like the Wilson Middle School thing, we could talk to each other in front of the group. And if we, debate stuff or disagree about stuff, and it wasn't this canned presentation. It was more of we tried to set up a dialogue among the different parties on the job and demonstrate that as we worked. The first time he asked me to help him run a partnering meeting, because he, as the illustrious professor, he was asked to run a partnering meeting. And he calls me about 11:30 on this day. And I hadn't known him very long at that point. He says, can you come over and help me out? Another one. Help me out. He said, in the afternoon, I said, well, sure, I'll come on. I didn't have anything to do that day. I'll pay $100. I said, sure, whatever. So that worked out, and it kind of began this journey of several years. And then I went off and did a bunch on my own. And so I'm eternally grateful for his bringing me on this complementary skill set that I was really intrigued with, and I think he found value in. He taught me a lot about the construction industry itself. And I didn't even know some basic terms when I started working with him. But also this essential fairness and sense of justice in doing things right on the job, in the field, and in all of his business dealings. And it was really wonderful kind of working with him. Um, well, there are a whole bunch of other little stories. I want to say also there was as I was at this point I was still kind of getting my feet on the ground, having just moved to Albuquerque, and he had this office at UNM that was kind of in the basement. It's no longer there as the college has been redesigned, but it was a parking lot that was kind of in between a bunch of buildings, and every so often I would just go over and park there and sort of hang out for an hour or two. And he never kicked me out. He always let me, I got the feeling he was kind of testing out some of it. This is where he introduced Last Planner to me, some of his process flow ideas. And I was amazed. I think he knew he was teaching me. I was the junior partner in the sense of construction. He may have learned a couple of things from me about facilitation, maybe, but his patience, his willingness to share all that he knew, he's always engaging. I mean, if you ever met Greg, there was a charisma and a charm about him that was really kind of almost enthralling. And it was part of his, and a little bit of quirkiness to go along with it, and his wry sense of humor. We clicked very well. I'm very, very grateful to have met him, as well as Dana and Emily.
The questions actually go hand in hand. I think what he valued guided what made a difference, and why he was such a magical person. Greg just genuinely cared about people. I was like a young guy, 22, 23 years old when I first met Greg. And he was a big deal in this space, and he was meeting with CEOs. He was working on multi-billion-dollar projects. But, Greg always made the time to mentor me, to talk to me. He had this presence, when people are engaged, like talking to you. And some people, they're just waiting for you to finish the next statement, or, they're looking at their watch, or they're, looking for someone else, in the crowd to talk to. And Greg never was like that. He was always like so engaged and made you feel like you were important. And it's a quality that few people have, that Greg, and I'm sure you've heard this in all these interviews, like the amount of care and time and effort that Greg put into people and how much he invested in people was something that was truly magical. And I often lose that sometimes when I'm off running to the next thing, or doing the next thing, or, trying to get to the next peak, in my career, or my, whatever legacy. And Greg didn't care about any of that. He carried himself in such a selfless, humble, inquisitive, awe-inspiring, yet insightful way that very few people possess. I mean, he was an incredibly intelligent individual, but always found a way to ask the right question very Socratically, right? As you were learning about it, because he could have told you the answer. And I think that's why he taught through game and simulation, is because, and storytelling, is because he loved having the light bulb go off for that person that he was teaching, because he was a teacher at the end of the day. That's what Greg loved doing, is he loved teaching others. So if the light bulb came off for them, or came on, and it was something that, frankly, it is lost in this day and age of, digital technology, sound bites, people moving at 1,000 miles a minute is this investment in a relationship that was so, the individual relationship that he wanted to let you know, like, hey, I care about you as a person. And I don't know, maybe I was just lucky that I had that type of relationship, but I'm sure that everybody else here in this room will tell you the exact same thing about Greg. And he was, I was on some stressful moments in my life that, frankly, Greg was one of the people that I had the honor of getting to call. Always picked up the phone, and maybe he didn't have the answers a lot of the time, or he did. Maybe he didn't want to tell me because he knew that was the easy way out. But he always made me laugh. Like, I never left a conversation with Greg Howell like uninspired or down or frustrated, maybe frustrated actually, but never left a conversation with him feeling like discouraged, because he had a way of lightening up everything and putting things in perspective in a way that is an art form. It's something that is so special and makes Greg Howe, like, his legacy, frankly, live forever. I wish I could tell a story as good as him. He was just so good about it, and his detail and everything, and how he made it lead up. He had people, leaning in on the edge of their seat. And he was, I'm going to be telling stories about Greg until I die. And I hope that, through his legacy and what he's built with LCI and lean construction, it will live for, generations to come. And I believe it will, because, like I said, when you just see something that makes sense and works, like, why go back to the old way is my philosophy. So anyway, I'm just honored to have known him, to be completely honest, and personally, because a lot of people, I think, will know of him in the future. But, I guess these stories and the way that we're able to capture it, a little piece of Greg can live on as well. So.
Yeah, my name's Tom Richard. I met Greg in 1999. He was teaching the lean construction last planner system courses. I actually took a couple of them. One of them I brought a client with me just to help them understand lean. And then knew Greg over the years, would go to see him at LCI meetings, bump into him, of course, there. And and eventually began working with the company he co-founded, Lean Project Consulting. Well, first of all, just his understanding of the last planner system, and importantly, his history with it. I'm sure more than a few people have talked about what he learned in the CBs in terms of as commanding officer and gathering everybody in to be part of the planning. But that idea that work is most effective when you engage the people that are doing the work and bring them into the thinking about it and the valuing of what they bring to the table in terms of their knowledge. That's one of the more important things that, unfortunately, it's still overlooked, but it's one of the most important things about work is how do you bring the people that have firsthand knowledge of how the work unfolds and how you can make it better. Greg was always on top of that and always on.
Really loved Dana and Emily and his family. He was gone a lot, but he always talked about them. He loved that. And he really loved the outdoors. He was a Westerner. He grew up in Phoenix when Phoenix was not a big famous city. He always had this love. He became an engineer here at Stanford. He was on the faculty at the University of New Mexico. He loved getting outside, and that's why he ended up being based in Sun Valley, so that he could be outside. He could be hiking and skiing when he wasn't on the road. One of the things he got to do very late in his life, and he finally got to tick it off, was he got to go down the Grand Canyon. And he and Dana went, and they went with a really quality trip with down the Grand Canyon, really long trip. So I think the other thing I would say about him was that he really had an international view of things, and he didn't have trouble going to Peru or Denmark or Taiwan or something to talk about lean construction. And that takes a certain level of openness and probably a sense of adventure to go do that. Well, I have one that's not related to the consulting we did. And it was something that I learned from Greg on the phone. Greg was always traveling. He used to say his home was on United Airlines. And one time and he also, way before Zoom, when we were in a consulting firm, we would meet every Friday at 9 Pacific, 12 Eastern in a sort of Zoom framework, whatever was the software then. And we would all be in those Hollywood squares. And we got to know each other quite well because we met every week. And then we'd have these annual meetings. But what I wanted to tell you about was he was saying, when I'm on the road, I found this podcast that I really like that's from the BBC called In Our Time. I went, really? And he said, yeah, they talk about anything for an hour. This guy will interview 3 professors about some topic. And so I looked it up, and he was right. The topics would be like Antarctica, and then there would be heat, and then they would be the Siege of Vienna. And so it'd be history, science, all kinds of topics, and really informed. And so that was how wide-ranging Greg's thinking and love of life was, that he didn't just go on the road and then read a trashy mystery on the plane. He listened to the BBC. And I love that about Greg. And I've been listening to In Our Time for many years, and every time I turn it on, I'm frequently crossing the North Cascades, and there's no reception for anything, but I can listen to In Our Time, and I think of Greg again. So,
my name is Victor Ortiz. I met Greg when I was working at Interaction Associates in 1984. We were working on a project by the then newly formed Pacific Bell Company, building a huge new office complex in the East Bay. And Greg had been called in to help them as a consultant, and we at Interaction Associates were called in to facilitate a meeting of the subcontractors, and Greg was observing that. The meeting was facilitated by my colleague and mentor Michael Doyle, and I was assisting. And I think it was the first meeting ever where Post-it notes were used in the construction industry to lay out the whole flow of how this project was going. This project had 4 identical office towers of about 5 stories, massive complex. The first one was behind schedule and over budget, and we got together the top 30 contractors of about 120 subcontractors to map out what had been the process in the first of the 4 towers, and to then look at where there had been breakdowns, where the process could be improved, and so on. Greg was sitting in the back of the room, and I don't think he'd ever seen a group of subcontractors and superintendents ever work together quite as well, sort of immediately. And they were putting up Post-its and rearranging and identifying things. At the end of this, he came up to us and said, "That was fantastic. We need to do more of this." And so we started becoming friends. Greg then said, I would like to learn to do this facilitation stuff. And I also think you should meet the smartest guy I've ever met, who was Glenn Ballard. And so Glenn and Greg came in 1984 to Interaction Associates to be trained in facilitation skills. And I was lucky enough to be one of the co-trainers for that very involved practice. They did a basic course and then an advanced course. There was a lot of videotaping and so on. And they were just such a joy to work with. Greg had his own business at the time. Glenn Ballard ended up leaving Bechtel and coming to join Interaction Associates. And we went off to work at Ford Motor Company, where we took a third of the time out of the product development cycle. And we were really getting into business process reengineering and collaborative design teams. And so between Glenn and Greg, this whole idea of collaborative design using facilitative leadership as a way to go became a key part in the whole development of the Lean Construction Institute. And now people use Post-it notes to do project planning everywhere around the world, and of course are now doing it automatically in computerized versions as well. I will probably share what a memory that many, many people have, which is what it was like to go out to dinner with Greg. Greg was a wonderful storyteller, and he also loved good food and he loved good wine. And so after a hard day's work, we would go out to some place, usually someplace quite special, and just relax and laugh and eat and have a good time. I really treasured Greg as a friend. He was a really special person, one of those people that you meet and think, wow, that's somebody I'd like to have as a friend. I'll say that one of the really good things that happened was that Greg came to visit before he died. And we had a chance to talk. I had been diagnosed with cancer and he had Alzheimer's. And we had a chance to talk about what life is about and about the fact that we loved each other, that we were friends, that we had both contributed in some way to each other's lives. And I'm so grateful for that opportunity. Greg was the model of ease when he was with a group. He always was slightly rumpled, hair slightly askew, a shirt tail slightly out, and he made everybody feel absolutely comfortable. And for me, being very concerned about getting things right and not knowing something, he modeled so easily curiosity as a way of being able to open not only himself up, but everyone else around him into a discussion of exploration of what was possible. And he did that so naturally. It was just his being. So for me, it was a wonderful mentorship in how to develop that aspect of myself, get a little out of my head, get more into the people, use humor. So that was, he was a mentor without really trying to mentor. It was just the way he was as a human being.
My name is Victor Sanvito, and I met Greg in when I was going to grad school at Stanford. He was one of our evening speakers, and when I heard him talk, I knew that was some of the challenges I was wrestling with in my own head. And so we connected, and I ended up working for him in the summers, actually on Glenn Ballott's job, and did some research that followed on his work, and our paths crossed professionally all the way through. The people doing the work, the most knowledge that exists about how to improve our business is with the person who's actually in the arena doing the job. It's not with the planners, it's not with the project managers, it's not with the designers. It's with that person out there who is delivering the work, who may or may not know the big picture, and the respect that you can show for a person is to give them what they need each day so they can be successful, because our work is inherently motivating. And so when you send someone out there and they don't have what they need, that's disrespectful to those folks. And I think focusing on the regular person doing their job is, to me, what I take home. And I got that from my father too, but this whole community has that in them. You know, is the industry in a better place today because of what Greg and this team and this group of people gathered here today did? I would say definitely yes. You know, and that's really that's really the piece that you can take away. I would say Greg was not a hero, and a hero usually solves big problems on their own and doesn't bring people with him. He was more of a team player, and so he'd bring the other folks around. You know, he always was trying to set up a alumni rugby game, and he's like, "But we need to get a game together. All I want to do is kick the ball off, and then I'll get off the field because I'm too old to take a hit." And that was his goal. You know, that never happened. But you know, if he'd taken a hit when he was my age, I'm that age now. When he started talking about it, you know, pieces of your body fall off. When you talk about Greg, you don't talk about one person. You talk about a community that was working together. And at that time, this community didn't compete. They all collaborated and they shared what they had. And so that taught me a lesson that, you know, you don't have to compete on everything. When you're trying to move an industry forward, you need to collaborate, you need to share, you need to explain what you're doing. So when you explain what you're doing, you have to organize in your own mind. You actually find out where the holes are. And, you know, it helps you learn. Explaining helps you learn, and then you try it out, and you find the mistakes, and then you have a collection of colleagues who share what they're doing, and you become comfortable talking about the errors you've made and what needs to be improved, and lessons learned becomes important. I think secondly, I was at Dana and Greg's wedding. I was working for him at the time, in their backyard in Palo Alto, and got to know them as a family. When my parents came over for graduation, Dana and Greg had him over to the house for dinner. I mean, he connected in a way. Work, thinking, and family were all the same, and I think he showed that balance and integrated them all together.